Welcome back. We're back for episode 2 of Forward Deployed, our new podcast about the intersection of software development, AI, and the enterprise. It's me, Noah Breyer, co-founder of Alephic, and Lance.
Great to be here again and looking forward to another good convo.
Me too. So I thought that we could start today's conversation by talking about my personal obsession with Claude Code Skills, which was this new thing that they introduced probably 2 or 3 weeks ago now, October 16th, I guess, maybe almost a month ago, where essentially they are not much more than a prompt, right? It's kind of a folder full of prompts and scripts that Claude Code knows about. And they've now actually introduced it into Claude proper on the web. And essentially, it allows you to extend the capabilities of the models and the application without having to load everything into the system prompt. Is that kind of how you understand it too?
Yeah, it's deceptively simple. All it is basically just as, I'm instructing a new hire on a given set of tasks, I might give them a directory with a bunch of different subfolders. Each subfolder is like instructions for how to do a thing. You're giving that to the model.
So this is the post I think I first learned about skills from. It's Simon Willison, who is on top of it all the time and writing a ton of interesting stuff at the intersection of things that we're interested in. And he was actually talking about this post from Jesse Vincent, I believe, who built a set of skills that he called superpowers. And he made it part of the plugin marketplace. So Claude Code also introduced plugins, but it just immediately clicked with me that this was a good idea. Essentially, the kind of core idea behind it is just instead of loading everything at once, you kind of allow the AI to figure out and progressively disclose what's available to it. And so I first got my hands on superpowers. Actually, I spent the weekend, this was a Friday, I think this came out. I spent the weekend getting it installed into some of my repos and getting it installed into some of my different Claude Code environments. And I thought I'd take you through a project that I've been working on, which I'm calling the Alephic CLI. And it's a tool I've now shared with the whole team, where essentially, in addition to having a bunch of MCPs, so I built MCPs for Google Drive, for Gmail, for Google Contacts, for our own transcripts, a whole bunch of other things. But also, I've been building out this kind of repository of skills. And actually, I've layered on top of it some other fun little tricks that I'm kind of excited to show you, because the one challenge that I've run into with skills is that you've got to trust the model to look for them all the time. And so I've been trying to find ways to solve for that. So let me open up my terminal and I'll take you through it. So here we are. We're in just my regular old Claude Code, but this is the Alephic CLI. And so if I ask it just to start, what kind of skills do you have? This thing is pretty loaded and I've been doing a whole bunch of work. But most interestingly, I think for me is behind the scenes, what I've built actually, which is kind of crazy, is so this get skill is a MCP that I wrote that is just a super simple skill search. It's actually running, I can't remember the name of the exact search package, but it's a TypeScript search package. So I wrote that MCP, but kind of more importantly is sitting behind that, every time you send a message, what it actually does is it invisibly runs first a query to Grok with a Q. Actually, I think I switched it to Cerebras now because I found that Cerebras was like twice the speed, but I wanted something super, super fast. So I have a super fast inference model that's running in the background on every single message that I send. And that super fast inference model writes search queries to then hit that search endpoint to see if there are any available skills. And then it actually hits it a second time to narrow the skills down, which it then injects back into the prompt all within about a second that Claude Code sees and decides whether to call them. So if we look up here, what kind of skills do you have? What it's doing here is these two skills here were actually inserted into the prompt. The prompt, it gave it the title, it gave it the description, and then it gave it the location. And then it's calling this get skill MCP to understand those skills. I've been working a lot. So, I think the idea is magical, right? Let me show you my skills first. So I'll go to here. You can just see fundamentally, I've got all my skills broken down into these different buckets. And if we go into any of those skills.
As an aside, while you're doing that, I will say this bash command in Claude is highly useful because Claude also sees the output of anything you do.
Yeah, that's great.
It's great.
So if you look in any of the specific skills, again, the sort of skill is super simple, right? It's just this skill MD file, which is
Right.
essentially markdown version of the prompt.
Yep.
And then you can have scripts and other references, any kind of documents that you make reference of in that skill. And so I've just found this to be pretty magical. But again, the one challenge I kept running into that I've been trying to solve, and I'm guessing Anthropic is going to solve this at some point, is
Yeah.
just how do I get it to consistently call the skills that I want? And so what I have going on in the background now is this pretty wild set of experiences where, you're running it through. I'm now using Llama 120B on
Mm.
Cerebras. It runs at 3,000 tokens a second.
Yeah.
So it can just rip. And so it writes the queries, it does the searches, and then it
Yep.
inserts it so that it's constantly getting better. And it's really, I'm just kind of blown away by
Yeah.
what it's capable of doing.
Actually, let's pause. Let's break this down a little bit. So this is a very good example. So right, so skills are just a set of subfolders in the skills directory. That's great. Now, what's interesting is, like you're saying, in any one of these skills, you can have scripts, you can have other documents, and they all have this skill MD file. That's great. And we'll talk about progressive disclosure later, but basically the front matter YAML from each skill MD gets loaded into the system prompt when you kick off Claude Code. And it's using that information from just that YAML. You can even show one if you want. Yeah, you can pull that up while I'm chatting. That's what it's using to decide what skill to actually call. The description there, that's what Claude sees and uses to determine what skill to actually call. So that's problem one that you're kind of encountering. You have a whole bunch of these, and all those YAML front matters are getting loaded up into the Claude system prompt, and it has to determine which one to call. So that's problem one. Then problem two is, or not necessarily problem, but just reality two is, Claude's using its native tools just to search through that directory and pick whatever skill based upon it looks at your request. It does an ls on the skills directory. Based on system prompt, it has the instructions for all available skills. It'll navigate to that folder and just read then the full skill MD and then do whatever else. That's all that's happening. So you're encountering the problem of, whoa, I now have 50 skills. How does it pick the right one? Classic problem. By the way, that was already a problem with tools. So that's always a problem with these models. How to get them to call the right tool or use the right skill at the right point in time. Classic problem. Now tell me about this router thing that you have.
Yeah. So if I step back out of that, if we go in, I built this as a hook, which I know we're going to get into a little later.
Right.
But if we go into my hooks directory,
Skills search. There you go. Right.
enforce skill search.
Yep.
So we look at what this looks like.
Yep.
Obviously, there's a lot of stuff here, and we don't need to go through all of it. But really,
Right.
this is kind of the real big piece of it, which is
Yeah.
I was trying to solve for this problem that there are too many skills. And I'm also,
Yeah.
by the way, I'm very curious if you're sure of this. I am not positive that even that front matter is getting loaded into the system prompt. My understanding was that it sort of has a sense that it has skills, but it's its responsibility to go look for it. It wasn't clear to me exactly where and when it's getting loaded.
No, the YAML front matter is always loaded, at least based upon all the documentation I've seen. And there's a very, very good engineering blog post from Anthropic on this. So this is what you showed. And this is just a skill MD file, always has a particular format. There's this YAML front matter. And again, that has that description thing that you showed in the skill name. Cool. And then it has a whole bunch of other stuff below. Okay. Now what's happening is this is the context window for example, Claude Code. This is the agent system prompt. And all these skills do get loaded in, but only the YAML front matter part. So you can see short snippets from each skill are appended to the system prompt. That is always happening. But to your point, that means that the model is only using this little description to decide what skill to call or what skill to use. That's the key point.
Yeah, cool. I did not know that, so I'm appreciative for a little more knowledge on this. So if I bring back up where we were in the hook, what I quickly realized is exactly what you're saying. You start to get 10, 15, 50 different skills. You very quickly lose all the reliability on it consistently finding it.
Yes.
And it's also a funny thing where I very quickly got used to it using the skills.
Yeah.
And so when it didn't find them, it became very, very troublesome very, very quickly.
Right.
Because I had offloaded so much of my regular workflow into these skills and into these
Yes.
scripts. And so what I ended up, I tried a couple different ways of solving for it. And this is my current approach. Again, all of
Mm,
this is a week, 2 weeks into really solving these kinds of problems.
yeah.
What I ended up doing is I've got this hook. The hook fires on every message that I send.
Right.
And the first thing it does is it makes a call out to, I started with Grok with a Q. I changed to Cerebras because I saw that Cerebras had twice the inference speed, tokens per
Yeah.
second.
Super fast. Right.
And so it just makes this very simple call, which basically says it gives it the message and it says, write 1 to 5 diverse search queries with different phrasings to maximize coverage.
Ah,
Um, and it's writing
right.
it, it's doing it with the 120 billion model, comes back super fast. And then what it does is it uses that to actually use my search tool. So it
Ah,
then searches, and that search tool is not just searching over front matter, it's also searching over the markdown. So it's
uh,
searching the full, and I've got a full search index in
funny.
here. And then I
Yep.
actually send it back to Cerebras one more
Right.
time to basically do the re-rank. All of that happens in a second or a second and a
Right.
half. Doesn't really feel like it has a huge effect for me on what's going on. If I say, can use scrape forward deployed.com. Let's see if this works. This should, in the background right now,
Find
be
that
calling
skill.
Cerebras. It should
Yep.
be looking
Yep.
for a scrape skill. It should then come back. We'll know it worked if it does a get skill here.
Right.
And then it should find my scrape skill. In this case, I also have an MCP doing this stuff, so I'm not
Yep.
entirely positive where it's gonna land, but
Yep.
we'll see what it comes back with in 1 second. The other thing I did here that is kind of an interesting twist is I started with just letting it use the regular read skill, the read tool
Sure.
for reading the skill, but because this is a team, so it didn't find it, I guess, on this one. It's just using regular web fetch. Because I have a team working on this, I wanted to be able to understand what are they searching for, when are queries hitting and not hitting. And so I am also writing all the queries to Cloud Redis. Now also writing all the reads to a
Yep.
Cloud Redis. So I can understand not just I can grab the skills, but I can also actually go in and I can see where are the hits, where are the misses. So it's looking at it's recording when do you search for a skill and it doesn't come back with a skill.
Yep.
And so I'm just, again, I'm playing with some of this stuff and
Yep.
having fun. But I have found skills to be a pretty miraculous
Yeah.
thing. And I think this other pattern that I've started to develop here, I don't know if you saw there were some posts even just out this week from Anthropic starting to think more about tool searching and, exactly the point you're making. I think one of the interesting things in all of the work that I find myself doing, I'd be curious to see if you
Mm.
see the same thing, is that I've just run it's all the same pattern all the way down, right? It's like we're all trying to control for context. We're trying to figure out how do you give it the right context at the right time. And it's feeling like everything is kind of centralizing around a couple key primitives and ideas that we keep circling back on.
So yeah, so this is actually very interesting. So we can break this down. Look, Claude Code has like a dozen tools natively, right? And you laid them out nicely. It's like glob, it's grep, it's fetch is a web fetch tool, it's bash is a bash tool, it has some file manipulation tools. That's all it has. Now with this skills thing, all those front matters getting loaded up into the system prompt for Claude, in this case Claude Code, that has its whatever 10 tools. And then it's just saying, okay, I want to call your particular like scrape tool. It's going to use its native file search tools to go to that skills directory and just hunt around, find something relevant. Now, what you're observing though is that wasn't good enough, and you hijacked Claude by giving it a new tool that you defined that has all this shit in it, which is totally fine, which is good. Not shit. I'm saying that in a fun way. Has all this stuff that you defined. You're loading that into Claude as an additional tool that it can call via MCP. So that's where MCP comes in. MCP is a way to bind or create new tools and give them to Claude. So that's fine. That's what you did. Now, the idea of skills is actually trying to move against that by saying, don't bind a whole bunch of things as tools to Claude because it can confuse the model. The more tools you give the model directly, the more things it has to choose from. So push that all out to skills. So basically, you have a skills directory that effectively has 60 different actions that the model can take. Now they live in that directory, and it only needs to call a few different tools to access all those functions or skills. So that's one of the main benefits of this skills idea is that you're not bloating the function calling space of the model. You're keeping it nice and simple. Remember, Claude Code only 10 different functions it can call, but it can access this multiplicity of actions in the skills folder. That's, I think, the big idea that's very important and interesting. But you're bringing up an interesting challenge is that, well, look, if I make that skills folder big enough, I still run into the challenge that it can't quite find the right skill, and I have to hijack the model and give it new novel functions like you're doing with via MCP to make it able to search that folder more effectively. So that's interesting. And this was always the same problem we had with functions themselves. Like, for all those skills, what if I wanted to take those and bind them all to the model as independent functions? The model then have to make a decision about which one to call. You're still having that same problem here, but now you've pushed that out to your skills directory. And now the problem is figuring out what skill to actually use. So you still have that problem, but you've worked around it effectively by creating a new tool, this new tool bound via MCP, that you use to kind of help your skill search.
Yeah, and part of what I have been feeling is I think eventually I'm going to move a bunch of those other MCPs out. And so I think the direction that things are headed, and I think there's some interesting takes on this either way, is that I'm going to try to narrow down what exists in my tool space as
Correct.
narrow as possible. I want that skill search there because I think that skills are important enough. But I
Yeah.
actually, what I think I will eventually do, and even calling it skill search, I forgot to mention that I'm also indexing commands in there.
Right.
So, and agents, because I kind of feel
Right.
like what they've come to is this idea that all of these things are kind of the same, right? They're
Right.
just ways to extend the model. And so
Correct.
I think where I'm going to land is let Claude keep its core set of glob, grep, write, read, layer on my search MCP, which essentially becomes a new tier one tool that can then help make decisions about which one of these other tools or agents or MCPs or skills it should take advantage of. And I don't know if you saw this post. This was
Yep.
from, I think, yesterday. And, they kind of get into a lot of this, right? They're going through and talking about some of these different patterns. I think we're all just feeling the same thing, right? Which is that we are asking these things to do such an incredible amount of stuff that we can't possibly keep loading it all into the system
Yes.
prompt.
Yeah.
And towards the end, they even offer up some other alternatives. They talk about Cloudflare had a technique that they wrote about a month or two ago where you actually kind of move away from the classic MCP definitions altogether and you have it instead extract TypeScript type definitions and you essentially just load those in. And so I think we're all kind of dealing with the same thing. And I think this question of what should be an MCP, what should be a skill, where
Yeah.
is the line between that, what's a command versus a skill?
Yeah. Yeah.
And, my increasing belief is that they're all just the same stuff. Like
Yeah. Yeah.
where that, and I'm kind of jamming them all together. But again, this is the fun of doing this kind of work is that we're all just living it and we're all figuring it out. I will say one thing, which is props to the team at Claude Code, because I will say it's amazing to see. I feel like the pattern at which myself and the community are figuring things out, and then Anthropic and the team over there is actually building it into the product is pretty incredible, which makes me feel like we're all just figuring it out together.
Yeah. I'll say something very interesting about that. I agree with a lot of what you said. I did a webinar with Manus, very popular kind of consumer agent recently. And they brought this up a lot. And here's a way to think about that I really like from Manus. We want to give LLMs or these agents the ability to perform actions. So think about actions. That is ultimately what we're trying to do. Actions via scripts or otherwise, right? Now, what they talk about is having a multi-tier action space. Okay, so tier one, exactly like you said, are the functions. Now, why is that tier one? Functions are directly bound to the LLM. Okay, functions are basically just things you bind to the LLM. The LLM can produce a JSON schema for every function, right? You know all about this. But here's the subtle point. The full function descriptions are always loaded into the system prompt. So they bloat up the instructions, okay? So that's kind of tier one are the functions. That is like those are like kind of the most core functions that the LM can call. Now, what's interesting is Claude Code, it has 12 of them. Manus, less than 20. A common trend we're seeing, like you're saying, is Give the models a small number of atomic functions that do very general things. And why is that? Because that doesn't bloat up the system prompt. Imagine giving the model 100 different functions. You bloat the system prompt with all those instructions. That's problem one. Problem two, it's confused in the model. Which one do I call at what time? The function descriptions overlap. Classic problem. What people are saying is minimize that. Small number of atomic functions that do very general things, but we still want the model to be able to do lots of actions. And so the take is from Manus, yeah, give the agent access to a file system, put a bunch of scripts in a folder, let it use its native bash tool and file search tool to find scripts and run them. That's exactly what Skills is. So Anthropic productionized the thing that Manus is already doing. And I know those two companies also work together, so I'm sure there's a lot of collaboration. That's the big idea here. Tier one are your functions, keep those light and minimal. Tier two is like you're pushing out a bunch of actions to just the file system. And look, just use native bash and file search tools to let the model, to let the agent find them and run them. That's all that's going on here. Now, you're bringing up a great point, though, which is, well, look, if I have a whole bunch of these things, like a huge number of skills, I'm back to the same problem of if I took all those actions and bound them as functions, I'd have the same problem as like if they all exist in this skills directory. So it is true that like search is hard in either case as these things get large. But the nice thing is, in the case of you, only the YAML front matters are getting loaded into the system prompt. So say you have 100 different skills, it's still pretty token light. Versus if those are all functions you bound to the model directly, it'd be pretty token heavy. You'd have all the full descriptions bound.
Yeah,
So
my
I,
big challenge was just getting the model to consistently look for skills.
that's right.
And so
Yeah.
that's where I've spent a lot of time over the last couple of weeks trying to figure out
Yes.
sort of the best approach. I'm not sure I have the best approach, right?
No,
I
I
mean, that's
know.
the fun of dealing with the thing
Yeah.
in the first few weeks. But
Yeah.
I do believe that if you
Yeah.
believe in skills, you also have to believe in something that will
Yeah.
help us find it. And I
Correct.
think this
Correct.
approach, I've tried 3 or 4 different things to get it to where it is, and I have found this approach to be pretty effective, far more effective than just trusting that the model will find it, even when I have a small number of skills, finding that the model will, because it's just hard to control the model to make sure it's sort of considering that every time. Part of it, I'm sure, is that the Anthropic folks are gonna, once skills get baked in more and more, they'll find ways to tune the model that comes into Claude Code to work that way more effectively. But for now, I think the direction I'm headed is very much how do I limit the number of core functions, those tier one functions, to be only the things Claude Code has, plus the absolute most necessary, including this skill search. And then how do I push everything else out to skills? And how do I create some loops so that I can kind of personally, so that I can see what's working, when is it working, how's it working? Again, for my team, I'm very interested also in how are you doing this at a team
Yeah.
level, not just at an
Yeah.
individual level. I
Yeah.
think the individual problem is a slightly different one,
Yeah.
but I've found this technique to be pretty good. And again,
Yeah.
I just loaded in a fairly simple
Yeah.
search library, right? So that, it's
Yep.
just got a JSON index and it's just doing a sort of fairly basic search. And again, the other funny thing about all this is that Claude Code is not that fast, right? Like
Yeah.
it takes
Yeah.
some
It took me
time.
4 or
And so
5. Yeah.
it's not ChatGPT where you're expecting an answer immediately. You're kind of working in this
Yeah.
other way. I don't know about you, but I'm generally working across 3 or 4 sessions at any
Right.
time. I've got a
Right.
killer work trees
Yeah.
skill
Use
that,
work trees. Right. Yeah.
is always cutting me across a
Yep.
repo. And
Yep.
so, generally adding, an additional second,
Yeah. Yeah.
even
Yeah.
2 is not a really big deal. And
Yep.
my one last thing I'll say on this is, and this is a good conversation for the future, but what Grok and Cerebras are doing with super fast inference models is still a whole space I don't think enough of us are really thinking about. I think that we're so locked into all the possibilities that happen with the core models and the amazing things we can build, but I'm just blown away that I can layer in 120 billion parameter model to just write some stupid search queries and have that not even be noticeable is a part of software development that I don't think I've fully ingested, and I don't think anyone else has either.
Yeah. Yeah. So one thing I'll note, I totally agree with how you're thinking about it. Minimize bloat in that tier one set of functions. You found the need to add one new function bound via MCP. That's totally fine. This skill search thing, that's great. A few things I might think about is remember, those YAML front matters are all that the model's ever seeing. And so you could think about improving those descriptions. Just like have Claude go through and rewrite the descriptions to make them better and more descriptive, so to help the model figure out what skill to call at what time. So that's obviously point one. How does Claude know when to call your get skill search tool? Like whenever you have a request, you always by default kick that off?
Yeah, so when I have a
Okay.
request, it's on
Get
the user message hook. I can't remember exactly
got it.
what it's
Use a
called.
hook. Okay, sure.
And so I'm using a hook, and
Yep.
the hook again is this it's actually three-step hook. The first step is it goes to Cerebras to write these queries. Second step is it runs the queries. And third step is it uses Cerebras to re-rank the queries. And then what it does is it inserts the front matter into the user message that finally goes to Claude Code with very specific instructions that it should probably call those skills. It should probably go grab those skills in that moment. So I did for a while insert the full skill, but then I was finding that was getting too much prompt bloat. And so I brought it back down, but it's basically I'm inserting it just in time and then giving it very specific instructions. One ask, if anyone from the Claude Code team is listening, I do think generally more control over what goes into those prompts as it's going to Claude Code is there's still space in the hooks world for us to get more control. And I haven't dug in. I know they released a new hook this week that I
Okay, so this is very interesting. This is very interesting. What you're effectively doing is a classic. You're basically doing query writing or query optimization. So basically, what you're saying is you as a human are going and saying a thing, I want a thing done. But you're not letting Claude see that, right? You're sending it through this hook to your little service that goes and looks at all your skills and then rewrites that query to say, I want this particular skill to be used, or not quite that explicit, but you know what I mean. Basically, it's giving Claude the prompt necessary to then find and use the right skill.
Yeah, so what it does is it appends it to the
Yeah.
user message. So
Yeah, I
it
get it.
leaves the original user message,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
then underneath that user message,
Funny.
it says, these are related skills, and
Yeah.
something like, you should probably search them right
Yeah,
now
yeah, yeah.
before you
Classic.
respond to the user's message.
Classic. This has always been the problem. This has always been the challenge, right? Whether you're binding a whole bunch of tools to that tier one layer or use this new skills thing, how do you get the model to call the right thing? That's always been a problem. It's always been a challenge. And like, yeah, we're not out of the woods yet. Just because we pushed a lot of actions to this tier two layer, we again have a big benefit because we don't bloat the system prompt with all those tool instructions. But look, we still need Claude to use its native tools, native search tool to go and find the right skill in this big skill directory. You're not out of the woods. And so in this case, yeah, you're doing query writing to help Claude out. I would look at improving your descriptions though, frankly, because those do get loaded in the system prompt. So actually what I would do, a funny hack here would be start to catalog the query writing that's done whenever you ask for certain things done, and then load those up into the descriptions. See what I'm
Yeah,
saying?
that's a good idea. I can try it. I will say, I'd be curious what kind of success you're having, but I would say my
Well,
hit rate on getting it to call skills without
yeah,
reminders that it needed to was maybe
yeah.
10%.
Oh, it's low. So I've only been playing with small numbers of skills, super simple, like toy examples, and usually have very specific keywords that I'll know to call, like web research or like line graph documentation.
It works great if you call it out,
Yeah,
for
if you
sure.
call it out.
And so some of this is just academic. I'm curious if I can make it work without calling it out.
Well,
But
right.
it's not academic in that I'm building a shared system for other users. And so in that case, you can't expect that every user is going to bring the right vocabulary every time. And I'm trying to figure out how do you unlock it on the fly? And I have found that the hit rate, even with only 4 or 5 skills, goes down very low very fast, even on very simple things when I have core skills and it just fails to call it. So I suspect that this is something lots of people are going to end up thinking about.
Yes.
And again, I think ultimately what we're seeing over the entirety of all this work is
Yep.
exactly the thing you described with Manus, which is just we're all trying to figure out how do we streamline the thing we tell the model at the very beginning, and how do we progressively disclose all of the other capabilities. But how do we do that as efficiently as possible, because the more we rely on those MCPs, the more we rely on the skills, on the commands, on whatever it is, the more consistent we have to be for users in actually getting them there, or the whole promise falls down because we end up building systems that are reliant on having those things, and the AI doesn't know to call it until the user explicitly asks. And so I think that's, that's the tension I'm playing with. If we're being honest, I'll probably have a different architecture in 2 weeks. So, I think it's been fun for me to play with. I have a question for you though, as
Right.
someone who has a much better sense of fundamental model architectures than I do, which is it feels like this skills concept is the next chain of thought. It feels like an incredible tool that fundamentally changes the capability of these models. And my question for you is there a path in the future where, just like OpenAI eventually figured out how to take chain of thought and build it into the reasoning models and
Right,
make it
right.
a fundamental part, is
Yes.
there a path where this kind of progressive disclosure becomes a fundamental part of the model, where it has sort of ideas? It kind of reminds me, I'm sure you listened to the Andre Karpathy
Yeah.
conversation on Dwarkesh, and he talked about this idea of like a really tiny model.
Yeah, right.
And I
Right.
wonder whether that's not what we're kind of getting towards with
No, it
skills, which
is.
is we're trying to
Yeah.
shrink the core model. We're trying to make
Correct.
it know as little as it can know so
Correct.
that it can be as smart in those things. And often we don't even want it to know about the other stuff that it can do, right? Even the things that it's learned out in the world, we don't want it to know a lot of that stuff. We want it
Correct.
to know only exactly what, and then we want to be able to sort of expose the skill. So my question to you, is that a possible path? Is that like something that makes any sense, or am I just talking nonsense?
I think the interesting thing here is that what we're doing with skills is we are externalizing context. And so you're basically allowing the file system to be like an externalized kind of memory system for the model. And I know you've talked about this quite a bit. So let's kind of break this down a little bit. So historically, computers has been something that model providers have been working on for a while. Tool use got really, really good, mid last year. More recently, with Claude Code, we saw models get really, really effective at particular tools. We talked about Claude Code uses 12 tools to manipulate the file system, i.e., a computer. File search, glob grep, bash tool to run commands arbitrarily. These are kind of the core tools that models have become extremely good at using. So Claude Code, for example, has been reinforced and fine-tuned to do what they call agentic search. And this is basically just really, really effective file search. Glob grep, it can poke around any repo you give it really, really effectively. So the point is, these models have gotten really, really good via reinforcement fine-tuning at manipulating and navigating file systems. And that's really what's enabling skills, because skills is basically taking a bunch of actions that previously you would bind directly to the model via MCP or as functions, and you're just pushing them all out to the file system and letting the model say, hey, use your native tools. In fact, you could just use your bash tool to poke around and find the right skill and use it. So I think that's a real trend that's happening here, is that we're seeing agents increasingly use fewer tools and externalize a lot more context out to, for example, a file system. Mana ships with like a code sandbox and a file system. They talk about this extensively. They have a great blog post on this. They talk about it in our webinar. Claude Code actually obviously has access to your file system. But increasingly, I think this trend of agents ship with a file system and a computer. You give the LLM those two things, and you push a lot of context just out to the file system and let the model navigate that file system and do things using a very small set of atomic tools. I think that's the big trend here. And it's pretty promising, because with a bash tool and access to a file system, you can do a hell of a lot. And we've already seen that, obviously, to be extremely effective, Claude Code being like the prime example of that. And where does this go? I mean, you can imagine, like the Karpathy point, smaller models that are extremely good at tool calling and reasoning. They don't have a bunch of context, like facts, baked into the weights. Context lives externally in the file system or this web search or so forth. So context is externalized from the model itself. The model is a reasoning engine that can make really, really, really good use of very simple atomic tools. You can kind of see that's where it's all going, and it makes a lot of sense.
Do you know who's working on that?
Well, I think all the providers are. I mean, it's clear that all the frontier labs are working on like models that are extremely strong at computer use. Start of that is like, using, like we said, these file system tools, the bash tool. I think typically when they talk about computers, they talk about literally kind of navigating the screen. Like that's actually separate. That's like a multimodal model that's looking at the screen and doing screen, like kind of actions on screen. But today, models are extremely good at basically using the command line and, bash tool and file manipulation tools. So all the frontier labs are obviously working on that extensively. Claude Code being like the prime example of an agent built upon those simple atomic tools. Again, it's only using about a dozen of them. And it's obviously been a smash hit. Not just for coding, by the way. There's a lot. I mean, you talk about this in your pod with Every. Yeah, look, what is a Obsidian project? It's just a bunch of Markdown files.
I got a shout out from Boris, by the way.
What are the coolest ones?
I feel like actually you had a Noah Breyer on the podcast recently. I thought like the Obsidian like kind of mind mapping note keeping use case was really cool. It's fun. It's insane how many people use it for this.
Yeah,
this particular combination.
Cool. So why don't we wrap things up real quick with a couple things that are on our mind, just fun stuff that we've been doing. I can get us started. One of the most fun little loops I put together, I was making a little site. We did this offsite last week with a bunch of clients, and so I needed to put a site up with the agenda and all this stuff. So I wanted to get it done pretty quick. I threw the problem at Claude Code, but then I also had it write up a creative director skill. And had it use the Google Chrome DevTools MCP and send screenshots to Gemini Vision. And so I told it was a creative director from a big design agency, and that it would go and it would look at the design that it had done, would take a screenshot of it, and then it would send it off to Gemini Vision with this whole creative director prompt. And that creative director would then give feedback to Claude Code that it could then loop its code on to refine the design for me. So that was a little fun discovery that I put some good work into, and I found both fun and effective. Spent a lot of time getting it to write out, trying to figure out what the best agency to choose was. I had it as a Pentagram creative director for a while. It was a pretty good trick.
Yeah, it's cool. I mean, it's funny. Some of a lot of people talk about the Puppeteer and the Playwright MCP tools as kind of two of the best, and things that can be very, very easily integrated with Claude. And kind of this feedback loop of like doing a thing, letting Claude like see a kind of visual output, like website or some kind of visual object, iterate is cool. Yeah, that's a fun design process in general.
Yeah, I found the big thing there, and this would be a fun one to talk about for the future, is just giving it also this persona and prompt that let it give very specific feedback so you could close the loop. Yeah. I think it's kind of giving it that kind of reflection, right? Like we talk about agents a lot, and ultimately the agentic ability requires that loop. We don't frequently, I find in my own work, don't frequently enough also provide it the kind of rubric so that it can get not just the kind of specific feedback from the linter or from me, or even its own feedback by looking at its own work, but actually getting that outside feedback that has some very specific rules and criteria. I found it just totally changed the way that it worked. So, it's just
cool.
It's just a pattern that I think is really effective. The other one is a shout out for Andreessen on the Cheeky Pint podcast.
The internet was it was a network technology, whereas AI is a computing technology. And maybe the only comp for AI that you can have is actually the creation of the computer, right? Because it's literally, it's the first major reinvention of the fundamental model of what is a computer in 80 years. Going from the von Neumann architecture to the neural network. And and if you trace the history back, they knew in the 1940s that these were the two paths. They knew what the neural network was in 1943. There was a big argument at the time of whether the computer should be based on fundamentally adding machines on cash registers, or whether it should be based on brain architectures. And it's just, we had to wait 80 years for it to work. But now we have the computer industry V2, right, which is much more valuable and important because of all of the obvious things it can do that the sort of hyperliteral von Neumann machines can't do. And so we've successfully unlocked computer industry V2. It's 10 or 100 or 1,000 or 1,000,000 times more important and valuable. And all of your petty comparisons to bubbles in the 1990s just wash out, because my God, look at what the thing. Look at what the thing can do.
The thing that really got me on there that I haven't been able to get out of my head, and I've been trying to write a piece about this, is everybody's searching for the analogy for AI right now. And is it the internet again? Is it whatever? Andreessen basically says that he thinks it's computers. And I am increasingly of that belief as well. I think the very best way to explain what Claude Code is, and AI is generally, is that it's a computer in your computer. And I don't think enough people are kind of really thinking about it this way. I know you've been playing with the Agents SDK and thinking about how you start to run this stuff in containers, but I think everybody is still looking at this as just, hey, we're going to have it write some code and do some stuff. But, you brought up, and I've obviously played with the Obsidian use case. These are fully functional computers, I think, and they're just able to run and operate and behave. And I think increasingly we're going to be thinking of them as back-end applications, right? Where you can expect them to do all these things. So yeah, I've had that Andreessen comment floating in my head, and computers and computers has been my thing.
Yeah, and I think an interesting way to look at that is so in the Claude Code podcast with Boris and Kat, they mentioned the idea of dual use tools. So basically tools that you or I would use, humans being, a flesh manifestation of a computer. We understand how to use tools on obviously our laptop or our desktop computers. And we're basically giving these agents access to those exact same tools. I think that's increasingly what we're seeing. And that's what's an interesting trend about Claude Code in particular, is that the tools it's using are the exact same tools that we would be using. It's bash tool, it's file system tools, it's the ability to run scripts. So it's kind of idea of dual use tools. These agents are able to use the exact same tools we do. They just use them much better and much more quickly oftentimes. I'd say maybe a segue into one thing I wanted to hit. I've actually found giving Claude Code access to the GitHub CLI is extremely good. If you're working on a feature, it has 5 different branches. You know the pain of this. You're trying to merge all those various branches, test them together, then independently manage the 5 PRs. Claude Code just does all that. It's a text interface over all the nasty kind of GitHub CLI stuff that is always extremely painful. It's great. There's also a really interesting command in Claude Code, PR comments. You can just suck down this, right? You suck down all the comments from a PR, address them. Great.
I have a great PR review command I'll share with you too. My other favorite command is I've got a pragmatic review command.
Yeah, right.
So it runs this kind of super pragmatic review based on don't repeat yourself, keep it simple.
Yeah.
You aren't going to need it. And I find that is
That's
really
cool.
killer. But I don't even think about it. I don't worry about merge conflicts anymore or any of those kinds of things. I think that is just the fact that we're all working in Git work trees now shows you sort of how far we've come. It's pretty amazing. Yeah, and I love that stuff. And I do find that loop having more power over Git. Git's such an amazing system.
Yeah.
And I, as not the greatest Git expert, never felt like I had the full toolbox at my disposal. And now, you can just do anything and make it work. And also, if you haven't done it, there's a command in Claude Code to install it into your repo so that you can run it on PRs.
Absolutely.
And
GitHub Actions. Yeah. Let me ask you a quick a workflow question. So let's say you're working on a feature. Maybe there's 4 different branches that kind of roll together in this particular feature, right? You want to manage those branches separately, separate PRs for easy review from other people, right? What's your development workflow? So basically, let's say you have 4 branches, or those four work trees, each in their own Claude Code. Maybe I'm just giving a hypothetical. So 4 branches, 4 work trees, each Claude Code. You're running all those. You have maybe a test branch. You merge them all into this, or you pull them all into this test branch. And then how are you managing that? What's the best practice there in your mind?
I don't run into that particular one too often, so I don't have a really great answer for you. What's yours?
There's different ways to do this. I'm working on a feature. It has lots of stuff. That stuff can be parsed out into different branches for independent review and independent PRs, which is often you need to do for people to look at it sanely. So so I'll have a big thing I'm trying to do, 4 different branches, 4 PRs, and I will have Claude Code kind of bring those all into a local test branch and test stuff together. But then if I find there's issues, I'll have Claude then kind of commit whatever needed to be committed from that kind of test branch back to the individual kind of feature branches and then up to the remote branches and the PRs. But that is a little bit clumsy. Sometimes using work trees, but not always. Sometimes doing it in a single Claude session. And Claude can very easily navigate between, okay, now I'm going to this branch, I'm going to, I tested everything together. I found that there's this issue. Then here's a code change needs to be made. Go back to the original branch for that particular part of the feature, make the code change, pull it back in, test it all together. I find myself doing stuff like that a lot, if you see what I'm saying.
My fun pattern for you on this tip, since we're just sharing workflow patterns, is that I ran into recently is the front end, back end feature.
Right.
And then what I ended up doing was add a meta Claude code that I shared with the team that could then orchestrate the front end and back end. So I actually had Claude code running in the front end branch, in the back end branch, and then in this meta branch that was basically actually writing a lot of the code for both of those and doing, running it and kind of making specific things because it had the full context across the full front end and back end. So that is the version of that I've seen. I would say for the most part, our development workflow is much more kind of single branch dependent. So we'll branch everything and then we'll branch into a merge branch and then branch into production, much less than have them running in parallel that have parallel dependencies.
No, I know, so part of the problem here is that it's typically the bottleneck is humans. So when you want humans to do code review, like you could absolutely develop this feature in one big branch. You push all that up as a ton of changes, right? So people say, why don't you break this up into a few different PRs? That's the challenge case, which is classic. Then you say, okay, cool, and then I go and I'll like create my various branches. And I'll be manipulating them all independently using Claude to kind of help. And then I'll be like rolling them all into a local branch that has everything combined for testing. And I am curious about kind of best practice for that style of work.
Sounds like you've got to do some more planning at the beginning, Lance.
Well, but this is classic, right? This is classic. What happens is two things. You have the independent branches. You develop them all independently. That's fine. You bring them all together. You're doing testing, and there's errors. There's bugs. And then so you have to go back and modify those individual branches reactively because, oh shit, something broke when you test it all together, right? Then there's review. So people come back and say, oh, make this change, make this change, make this change. So there's this challenge of you have to test everything together in one kind of combined branch, but you have to like make modifications to these individual separate branches for easy review. And, it's a classic. Now, another way to do it is you could, just have one massive branch you do all your development on. You get it working and then you parse it out into the individual feature branches for final review, and then you put it in.
Or you make the plan at the beginning and you sequentially build out branches.
Well, yeah, that's true, but then you still have to test everything together.
You do have to test, but it's easier because you're getting it merged as you go.
Yeah, feature one, put that up for review, get that merged. That's true. Now, typically the problem is like it's all one big feature you're trying to get in at once. They're all dependent. So you can't just merge things into master without it all has to kind of go together.
I've got a fun place to leave this, which is I have been in the process of building a corpus of the top 200 engineering blogs to use as a way to get advice and feedback and build skills and best practices.
Yeah, it's
so maybe what I can do for next time is come back to you with the definitive answer from the top 200 engineering blogs on the question that you're asking.
I know.
We can figure out, we can build and release a new skill for how to manage your work and planning across this.
I know. Funny, because part of this is the challenge of working in the real world on teams of humans where like, listen, a lot of times you actually need and want humans to review things. And so for human review, things have to be nicely parsed up into individually digestible PRs. But then for testing, they all have to be stacked and run together and so forth. And so that presents like kind of a tricky challenge. And what is nice is Claude is extremely good at doing all that for you. So like, I will tell Claude, okay, now we're on our test branch. It has these 4 different branches all combined together. Here's the 4 PRs. Test it. Oh, okay, error here. Why? Oh, okay, we need a change to this part of the code. That's in PR2. Push that back to PR2, update PR2. And you end up doing stuff like that. And it's actually very good at it.
Yeah?
Yeah, it's a classic problem. Even if it's perfectly broken up, that's only part of the problem. It is true that features you need very good individual branches. That's absolutely true. You need that. But it is also true that like when you're testing them in practice, things are going to break. And like you need to be able to go from like a combined test branch back to the individuals to make minor updates. And you have review. So review comes in, you have to make the individual changes. You have to pull them all back to a test branch and test everything together. So you can maybe generalize it to, let's say you have perfect planning and partitioning of 5 branches. Okay, perfectly planned. 5 branches. That's great. They all combine together into a thing that you test together. What's the right way to manage that? Like I can 100% imagine you have 5 branches, you have 5 Git work trees, you have a Claude code for each one, building out those features, and then you have an independent 6th branch where you're testing it.
That's the merge test branch. Yeah, I think that sounds right. That's the approach. That's what makes this fun, though. We're all just figuring it out. Thanks for taking the time today with me, Lance. This was super fun. Again, keep talking about building things, and we'll be back next week or the week after.
Yep. Sounds good.